Hello again, everybody. Welcome to Calamasa Insider. I'm Will Colwell, City Manager for the City of Calamasa. And as we wrap up our July episodes, we are also wrapping up our series on the realities in which we operate within Calamasa and in cities in general in California. And we've seen where the city does not have a lot of control over its revenue and is limited by external forces, irrespective of an increase in costs. We have looked at land use in its history and what factors influence decisions that planning commissioners and city council members make, and how various circumstances have changed over the years, thus shifting the factors in those decisions. I would venture to say that council members making a decision today may have come to different conclusions in years past. And there are many things that go into that besides what we have talked about, such as changes in consumer behavior, technological advancements, and many other things. But today, we're going to look at economic development, probably one of the most misunderstood elements in local government. So let's start with the basic question. What is economic development anyway? So according to the California Association for Local Economic Development, or CalEd, it is defined as the creation of wealth from which community benefits are realized. It is more than a jobs program. It is an investment in growing your economy and enhancing the prosperity and quality of life for all residents. But even CalEd admits that economic development means different things to different people, and economic development professionals struggle to truly identify what it means. Now, according to CalEd, there are three ways to enhance local economic development. Number one, business retention expansion. It's enhancing existing businesses. Number two, business expansion, attracting new businesses. And three, business creation, encouraging the growth of new businesses. So for the city, we want to create quality of life. In order for us to provide that, it can be both direct and indirect. And so when you look at economic development, the quality of life could be options for shopping, more and higher paying jobs. And these are obviously not created directly by the city, but how the city operates can certainly influence that. So when redevelopment agencies were around, there were more direct government involvement because we could create incentive programs and improve infrastructure that service businesses. But now we still did this back then too, but we can still do that now, is trying to minimize red tape while still balancing that with maintaining standards, of course, and embracing businesses that want to locate here can lead to increased activity and interest. And this is where, when we talked about land use decisions can be important because if a community develops a reputation for rejecting development in various types, businesses will less likely want to come locate here. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. They do look at these things. They look at the temperament of the community and their acceptance of various types of development, and it will influence whether they want to enter that market or maybe look elsewhere. And this increased economic activity can also obviously increase property values, which, by the way, only creates a real increase in tax revenue when it's sold due to Proposition 13. It can also increase spending, which increases sales tax revenue and fee revenue. And these increased revenues directly relate to the city's ability to enhance services. So the question then becomes, what can the city control and what can't it control? And so my favorite line that I see on social media all the time is the city needs to insert the name of a specific business here. And it's usually Trader Joe's or Costco. Although with Costco, I'll just say, be careful what you wish for. The revenue is great for the city, but, and obviously having it there, having that near your home is great. But, well, if you think warehouses create a lot of traffic, I have some bad news for you when it comes to Costco. And Costco, they literally call it a warehouse, I guess, too. But the amount of traffic that a Costco creates is pretty startling. And this is such a prevalent attitude and thought it actually didn't take me long to come across an article from Strong Towns entitled, "The City Should Have Put a Trader Joe's There." So I took some quotes directly from the article because they said it way better than I could say it. So this Trader Joe's line is an exaggerated for laughs case of a much larger set of sentiments in which people complain about some development or some change happening near them by saying, well, I would rather it be such and such. Why didn't they do that instead? And in response to this ought to begin with, who's they? The reason the city can't put a Trader Joe's there is because the city does not make that decision at all. What would have to happen for a Trader Joe's to go into that spot in your neighborhood where you'd love to see one? Well, the private landowner would have to be interested in developing a retail space that meets all of Trader Joe's specifications. Simultaneously, Trader Joe's would have to be actively looking to expand in your region, and they would have to be made aware of and interested in that particular site, which for a large chain grocer means a market study that checks several obligatory boxes regarding factors like population, density, demographics, spending power, and the presence of competitors. And then Trader Joe's and the property developer would have to agree on terms of a lease, and neither party opt out of the deal for some better option. At some point, peripheral to all of that might be a permitting or rezoning process in which the city grants its approval for a grocery store to occupy the space. But it's very rare that a local government actively recruits a specific business to occupy a site, let alone when that site itself is private property. Lobbying City Hall on a decision that City Hall doesn't make is an exercise in futility. Now, I will say it is true that part of economic development is trying to attract certain businesses to our city. So when we go to the International International Council of Shopping Centers conference, and we meet with various retailers, there are brokers there for specific outlets. So In-N-Out, Costco, Olive Garden, Sam's Club and Walmart, different brands. They are there, and we can go and make them aware of us. But again, it's up to them to decide to locate in our city. So remember, when we talk about land use, we can get down to the type of uses, commercial, industrial, for example. Then when a user is identified, let's say a grocery store, we can shape the conditional use permit and conditions of approval based on that use. We can also try to attract a Costco-like user by allowing a larger store footprint or other types of use that would permit a Costco. We can even offer financial incentives. So let's say we share a portion of sales tax with a user that produces a minimum amount of sales tax. We talked about that a little bit last week. That would narrow down the types of businesses that could achieve that and therefore be qualified for the incentive. This was more common, like I talked about last week, in the RDA days. So especially with car dealerships. So think of Cerritos Auto Square, for example. The city of Cerritos made that a redevelopment project area and specifically targeted auto dealerships, and obviously has been very successful with that. But they didn't choose which brands are going to locate there. Ultimately, the market decided that. So remember, we're not the ones that will decide if that grocery store spot will be a Stater Brothers, a Vons, an Albertsons, or a Trader Joe's. Only the private landowner and those individual private businesses can decide that. Another thing you have to understand when it comes to certain businesses is, what are they looking for? So let's go back to the Costco example. I think we have heard quite a few people say that they would like to have a Costco as an anchor of, let's say, Oak Valley Town Center. From a revenue standpoint, it would be great, and it would produce a lot for the city and would allow us to do a lot of different things for the community. But what does Costco require? They want a 5-mile radius population of at least 200,000 and a median income of $75,000. Now, they obviously will make some exceptions for that. So if you've ever been to Maui, you'll see there's a Costco right near the airport. Obviously, the permanent population in Maui is far less than 200,000 people. But the reason it works there is because a lot of tourists that will be renting an Airbnb or something like that, a short-term rental, will go there and stock up. So it largely serves the tourist population rather than the permanent population of the island. So there are some exceptions to that, but there is no real travel component here. So they're going to focus on permanent residents in this case. We actually do meet the requirement for the median income for the area. So for $75,000, if you look at Calamasa as a whole, we actually exceed that. And but however, the 5-mile radius population around the Oak Valley Town Center is only 85,000. And we have some inherent challenges that will make it almost impossible for us to reach the 200,000 target. I'm not saying they're bad things. I'm just saying they're reality. First, we have a permanent open space to the west that stretches several miles, so you'll never have population in certain areas there. We also have some permanent open space on the east side, but it's more the rugged terrain that would make it more difficult to build. So you're not going to see a lot of development to the east. So, where we have the next phases of Summerwind, the completion of Tournament Hills and Fairway Canyon in Beaumont, that's the extent you're going to see development probably within that 5-mile radius. It might reach a little bit into Banning, probably reaches into Cherry Valley. You're not going to see a lot of development in Cherry Valley. So that population could maybe get up to maybe 115, 120,000 at the most. So we probably will never meet the criteria to get a Costco, unfortunately. Now, Highland, for example, was recently announced as having a Costco being built at Green Spot Road in the 210 freeway. The 5-mile population around that location is 227,000 people, so they clearly meet that. And Costco knows that cities want them, so they can be picky of where they go, because it's not like they're building 100 of these stores, 150 of these stores every year. Nationwide, they built 13 in 2020, 20 stores in 2021, and then 23 stores in each of 2022 and 2023. So they're averaging roughly 20 stores a year. Now, during the RDA days, you would see cities take a build it and they will come approach. So, in other words, the conventional wisdom is, in order to attract different types of retail, restaurants, things like that will produce revenue for the city, you need to have rooftops, you need to have a job center that will have people that will then utilize those businesses. There's been this shift that the businesses now are looking for existing retail and restaurants to serve their employee population. So there's been a bit of a flip in that a bit, but there is still this philosophy of build it and they will come in. I'll give you a couple of examples. So they could do tax increment, because of tax increment in the RDA days, they would receive a payback of that investment and then some. So they would outlay stuff to improve, buy up land, fund business incentives for businesses to come there, build the infrastructure ahead of time, all the sewer and utility connections already there, ready to go, things like that. They would front load it, and they would use RDA money to do it. Now that prospect is more risky, but there are some cities that are doing it every way. So, for example, some cities now are investing heavily in technology and digital connectivity to try and attract high-tech industries. So they're building fiber lines everywhere, gigabit internet, things like that, to attract some of these higher-end high-tech industries. Now, that's very, very difficult to do, and it's a very risky proposition because it's a lot of money up front, and they may or may not come. So building they will come doesn't always work. But the classic example that we see of this phenomenon is sports stadiums. So in this approach, where you have cities that subsidize stadiums, is almost universally condemned by the public. It's a great question. Why are cities subsidizing these rich sports owners, right? That's usually the question. And the theory is that the investment will be paid back through increased economic activity, and therefore tax revenue can lead to restaurants, bars, hotels, retail businesses that pop up around the stadium. Often tickets have fees that go back to the cities, and parking revenue is either shared or there's a tax involved in that as well. These incentive programs, usually sometimes it's not just the cities just fronting that money and they're just paying for it, right? It's usually a loan or something like that, where then the payback is through a revenue share, or maybe it is directly a bond payment that is received from the sports owner. And these usually, like I said, these incentive programs usually involve some sort of revenue sharing. So the city's taking some risk, but they're also getting shares in the benefits that come along with it. Now, sometimes they work out great, sometimes they don't, but more often than not, they really don't. They work well in bigger cities. We saw, city of Stockton famously did this. They invested a lot in their riverfront and their port there. And they built a baseball stadium, they built a hockey arena, bunch of infrastructure right on the water there through their RDA. And then, of course, the bottom fell out in the late 2000s that we talked about with the Great Recession. And that was one of the reasons that they went into bankruptcy, actually, was because of that. The city of Glendale, Arizona has actually seen a little bit of both, right? So they've done well with State Farm Stadium, which is where the Arizona Cardinals play. They've hosted several Super Bowls and will continue to host Super Bowls into the future. They've had, big headline concerts. It's the biggest venue in Arizona. So, and Arizona's populations have been growing by leaps and bounds. So now the city of Glendale does not own the stadium. It's owned by the Arizona Sports Authority, but they do get tax revenue from the ancillary facilities around it. But adjacent to that is the Desert Diamond Arena, which is the former home of the Arizona Coyotes, who have now since moved to Utah. And that has been, from all accounts, a dud. So it didn't work out. And the city of Glendale actually owns the arena, but it is adjacent. So they share that entertainment district that, surrounds both of those facilities. So, kind of wrapping it all up, I think it can be seen that economic development is another important factor over land use decisions. And although economic development professionals will tell you that their field is not community development, it is different. It certainly is influenced and can be limited by land use decisions. And, so you look at things like, when you're looking at the economic development aspects of the land use decision, you can look at things like, how many jobs will a project create? What kind of jobs are they? What kinds of revenue will it produce? Will it cover the incremental public services and facility costs? So, for example, just to be quite frank, the costs of a retail center for police is going to be higher than for an industrial complex, because retail does lead to an increase in theft. If you look at our crime maps, usually it's concentrated in the retail areas, and so that's where a lot that does reduce crime, and so it does influence the need. It does influence the need for more police services more greatly than industrial use does, by and large, when you're looking at non-residential uses anyway. Does it create something that the community will be able to use? And by the way, not all uses are going to do that, nor quite frankly should they. I mean, there needs to be a place for everything, right? So there's going to be a place for offices, things that are going to be used by just a business, right? That aren't necessarily there for the public. But that doesn't mean that you don't want medical facilities or retail establishments or entertainment establishments and things like that. There's some things for everything, and then those things contribute to quality of life, but they don't necessarily produce revenue, right? So there's that give and take on those things too. And then we also have to look at how changes in consumer demand, technology, social attitudes have influenced the marketplace for land development, right? Because what's happening in the market is going to influence how land use development works. And so, Amazon didn't exist 30 years ago, and it really didn't come into prominence until the last, 10, 15 years. 20 years ago, when Victoria Gardens opened, nobody was thinking about Amazon and its influence on retail. But nowadays, you're never going to really see something like a Victoria Gardens built again, not at least without a mixed use component. with housing. It's not going to produce as much revenue because people are looking for more experiences. The only experience that really produces tax revenue or sales tax revenue are restaurants. That's about it. A lot of entertainment venues do not. And if we want to limit the types of development we have in our city, what kind of economic consequences come with that? Are those limitations something that we can accept and live with? So those are all these questions that need to be asked when you're talking about, the economic development impacts and influence that are thrust upon land use decisions. And I said it last episode, every decision and every action we take in city government has a ripple effect. We have to look at the precedent a decision can potentially make. We need to look at how laws change. Maybe we are forced to make decisions that we otherwise wouldn't make or did not have to make before. Public scrutiny, I think, in public distrust is an all-time high, or at least higher than it's been in many, many years. And our discourse has been very broken. And yet information is more readily available than it ever has been. And nonetheless, the scrutiny does influence how we make decisions. And this isn't always a bad thing. People can and should question their government. It's one of the fundamental principles of our country since the very beginning. But is that scrutiny always correctly placed? Are we asking the right questions? Or are we making assumptions that every decision we don't like is a result of something nefarious? If that is where we set the bar, likely nothing will ever get done. And the consequences for that would be dire. I think that we would be really going down the wrong path at that point. And so with this podcast, in particular, these last 4 episodes, I'm hoping to change the narrative a bit and put the cards on the table. I want people to understand how we operate as a city as much as I can. I want to pull that curtain back as much as I can. And education, we're talking about high school usually, whether public or private, has done a poor job at teaching government and civics. We see everything as just a generic government. But if you've been listening to this podcast, I think you know by now there's a great deal of difference between the levels of government. In fact, city staff probably gets more frustrated with the state and federal governments more than you do. I really believe that. But local government ends up getting the short end of the stick. And I don't want to sound like I'm complaining, but it is true. We are the most accountable to the population. You have the most contact with your local city officials, whether it's myself or your city council members. But we have the least amount of power of all the levels of government. And really, if you think about it, the states probably have the most power because the United States Constitution limits the federal government's power and puts much of it back on the states. That was one of the things our country was founded upon. Remember, the 13 colonies were independent of each other. They all just came together to fight a war against England. And once they kind of fought that, there was a chance that we'd become 13 different nations at that point. That was a very real possibility. And it almost happened that way, if you look at the history. But we decided to put this federation together, and it was by limiting the power of the federal government, investing a lot of power in the states is how it got done. So the states then can give as much or as little power to local governments as they want. There's no limitation, at least in the United States Constitution, as terms of what has to go down to a city or to a county versus the state. And historically, states have given cities a lot of deference and leeway. But we've been seeing that change in ways we have described on this podcast. We talked about that with the housing last week and in our land use workshop as well. So I hope that going forward, we can have a better dialogue about decisions the city is facing going forward, given our current reality and the things we are limited by. I really would like for people to understand that the things described in these past 4 episodes really have a lot of influence in how we operate as a city. And again, it's a reality that's shared amongst most cities in California. So again, these are things that are not just unique to Calamasa. As a matter of fact, it's common. We're seeing it in action probably more so in other cities than in Calamasa right now. We're lucky to be in a position that we're having to deal with it relatively, the amount that we're actually being influenced by it is minimal compared to some of the cities around us. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this week's episode. Thank you for joining me this week. Please share this podcast with your friends and neighbors. Get the word out about it. Share the podcast with them on your favorite podcast app, or tell them to search Calamasa Insider on YouTube. I put a lot of work into this podcast to break down the complex world that our city operates in an easy way to understand way. I hope that you find it that way. But if you ever have any questions or comments on the podcast you want to ask me, please send me an email at calamasainsider@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. We've talked a lot about decisions made by City Council, and those decisions take place on the first and third Monday of each month at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Senior Center, located at 908 Park Avenue, right here in Calamasa. So until next week, try to stay cool in the heat of the summer, and I will talk to you again next week. Take care.